Okay, I think that justifies to start the session. Maybe still some more people come. So I would like to welcome you to this SB56 side event hosted and organized by the German Emissions Trading Association. My name is Robert Tippmann. I'm the moderator and your host today. Topic is approaches and tools for supply chain decarbonization and avoidance of deforestation. Just quickly, the association is for the last 20 years an observer organization organizing such events on topics like mitigation, market mechanisms, climate finance, and related things. It started initially as more like a business association. Nowadays, we basically try to inform, there's a group of experts trying to inform also the public as well as experts on topics like mitigation, market mechanisms, climate finance, and provide opportunities to present related studies, reports, and so on, or a platform for panel discussions and at events like here at the UNFCCC, COPs or subsidiary body meetings, as well as other conferences. Myself also, I work for the last plus 20 years on climate action program, project development, climate finance, and related project program development, implementation, and advisory services. How do we want to proceed today? I would like to briefly introduce the topic today, then introduce the panel, and some housekeeping issues related to, but since I think we're a small group, we won't have that much difficulties with a Q&A session and how to organize that. Supply chains, for quite a while, it's a topic for a few years. Also recently, as we've seen in the news, even during the Corona crisis and most disruptions in supply chains, and most recently the war in Ukraine, that also is a bit like, brings us to the topic or the scope of this study that we want to present today, actually about agriculture commodities, agriculture supplies, which is an issue as we've seen in the last few weeks in the news. Link between consumption in the north. Here, when we talk about food industry and food consumption, that's the demand side, and then linked to unsustainable supplies from the south, and causing and linking that also to climate action, causing a considerable amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So there should be opportunities to link supply chain management, in particular linking supply with demand. It should offer ample opportunities and entry points to also see how we can reduce emissions. So there are a couple of questions you ask yourself when you think about that. What are the main causes? Which products and processes are the big emitters? Therefore, potentially also big wins here if you want to move as fast as possible. How can we achieve that the private sector and other supply chain actors in the north and the south are enabled, encouraged, or incentivized? And just some background figures, for example, also here in the EU or in Germany, we look at reducing by mid-century 50% of agriculture greenhouse gas emissions, and 35% EU or Germany by 2030. And that's not only, we also need to do quite a lot in developing countries and economies in transition, since in many of these countries the agriculture sector is very important, or one of the most important economic sectors. Causing, and also here some latest, most recent figures, for example, only German agriculture imports cause currently 58,000 hectares of deforestation is linked to direct German agriculture imports. Soy and palm oil are major forest risk commodities imported by Germany, and currently the 2-3 top forest risk commodity producers when we come to German consumption are Brazil, Indonesia, and Paraguay. So how and can we link also demand side, companies in the north, in Europe or Germany, and supply side for even more ambitious greenhouse gas emission reductions in agriculture and food supply chains. Question also, where do we currently stand? What are the frameworks or regulations and legal frameworks that are in place or expected to cause more action? We'll hear something about that as well later. As well as what are existing toolboxes of approaches, market incentive mechanisms, instruments, and tools to push forward. That's also what we'll hear later today in the study presented by Climatekos. So this is actually the background against which we'll hear the study. That's will be presented by two people from Climatekos about there's some first outcomes of a project about potentials for greenhouse gas reductions via supply chain management of agriculture commodities and related mechanisms, instruments, and tools. The study is also financed by a public German funding from BMZ. And I understand, I think they'll say a little bit to that also. These are first outcomes, and there's more to be expected as the study continues later in the year. This will be followed by views from GIZ, representing an EU or German perspective on the matter, and then an international perspective by a representative from the UNFCCC Secretariat, obviously taking the international perspective. So the panelists are, so on to my left we have Bernd Liss, Head of Climate Change and Climate Policy, GIZ. We'll say a little bit later what he's actually talking or commenting about. Then we have Salwa Bahbah, Project Manager from Climatekos, presenting one part of the study. Laura Bentz, also Climatekos, researcher at Climatekos, starting the introduction of the presentation of the study. And finally, Alejandro Kilpatrick from the Climate Change Secretariat, Means of Implementation Division, Team Leader Capacity Building Subdivision. Well, we'll pay a bit attention to time. That will be my job, so that we have a bit of time at the end for Q&A here in the room, as well as I'll observe whether there are virtual participants that may follow online and have some questions. Okay, with that, without further ado, then I would think we would start with presenting the study. And Laura, please, if you come and.
Okay. My side as well. I'm very glad to be here today. I will just open the presentation. Just a second. Yes, perfect. So I'm happy to give you deeper insights today into our ongoing project, which focuses on deforestation-free supply chains and specifically on identifying potentials and mobilizing these potentials for corporate action. So giving you a brief overview of today's agenda, I'll start with introducing you to our project, giving you a bit insight on the background and aim, and then I will give you a brief overview of the deforestation trends, hotspots, as well as policy responses and instruments. And then my colleague will take over and give you a deeper insight into the specific instruments and mechanisms we looked at. So starting with the background, as Robert mentioned already, the study was planned on joint consideration by the BMZ, the GIZ, and Climatekos. And what was central to these considerations was the increased awareness of the importance to make global supply chains more sustainable. And you can see this increased relevance also in the legislative project. So if you look at the German side, there's the law on supply chain due diligence, which focuses mainly on human rights, and environmental aspects are only considered if they are in relation with this human rights violation. So currently, aspects of climate or biodiversity are not included. But if you then look on the European side, there are two important legislative proposals. On the one hand, the legislative proposal on corporate sustainability due diligence, and this, in contrast to the German law I just presented, focuses both on human rights violation and environmental damage. So it is more far-reaching, but still it doesn't include explicitly the avoidance of deforestation. However, there's a second important legislative proposal which focuses directly on the mitigation of deforestation in global supply chains by focusing on 6 primary risk commodities, which you can see on the slide, and to guarantee a minimization of deforestation, 2 conditions must be met. So on the one hand, the products must not come from forests degraded or deforested after December 2020. And as a second condition, the products must be in compliance with the law of the country of origin. So, and as you can see from this legislative proposal, there is a need for preparing action for companies in order to, in the future, comply with this law. And they need to identify, define, measure, and monitor all the risk along their supply chain, and then also to have the power to take countermeasures in order to comply with these laws. So our study is mainly about supporting companies to establish more sustainable supply chains, and this is of central importance because reducing deforestation is one of the most effective options for climate change mitigation. So there's a huge potential. And it is, in this course, it's especially important to identify what are the potentials, but also what are the problems and possible solutions. And to do so, we first did an analysis of the current state of research of agricultural supply chains, and then we focused specifically on different mechanisms and tools how to make supply chains more sustainable. So on the one hand, we focused on standards and labels, but also we focused on how instruments and market mechanisms from the environmental and climate finance could set financial incentives to strengthen the sustainability. And last but not least, we also focused on tracking and transparency mechanisms and how they could help strengthening the sustainability by increasing traceability. So during this course, we tried to take a mostly practical perspective, really focusing on the challenges of companies and how to find solutions for the future. And this is also what we can present today, giving you first initial insights into our current study. And then in the next phase, we will start with case studies to get more practical insights. So coming to the global tree cover loss, it can be said that the most deforestation is actually occurring in the tropics. So this is why our project also mainly focuses on this region. And the main cause of tropical forest loss is expansion of commercial agriculture. It accounts for roughly half of global deforestation, so it has a huge impact. And you can see it in colored red on this map. It's mainly dominant in Brazil, but also in Indonesia and Malaysia, for example. And in some regions, there's also small and medium-scale agriculture, quite dominant as a driver of deforestation, and this is colored in yellow and is mainly dominant in Central America and Africa. So now focusing a bit more on the agriculture as a main driver of deforestation. On this slide, you can see the 7 main primary risk commodities for deforestation. And these 7 agricultural commodities are responsible for almost 60% of agriculture-related tree cover loss and almost 30% of the global loss of tree cover between 2001 and 2015. So it has a huge impact. And it's a destruction of more than 70 million hectares of forest, an area which is twice the size of Germany. And as you can see, cattle in specific has a huge impact with almost 45 million hectares. So now having a deeper insight into the hotspots and drivers, it can be said that the problem of continuing forest loss is recognized by policymakers. There have been a lot of commitments during the past years to combat this forest loss. So, for example, there's the New York Declaration on Forest, which was adapted in 2014 with the goal to halve forest loss by 2020 and to strive to end it by 2030. Deforestation is also explicitly mentioned in the Paris Agreement, Article 5, and the Sustainable Development Goals in the Goal 15. And more recent examples are, for example, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, as well as the Seoul Forest Declaration, which was just adopted last month. So there is a continuing acknowledgement of the importance to really do something against this ongoing deforestation. And in this course, over the last decades, also many instruments developed from different actors to do something against deforestation. So, for example, the REDD+ program, which is quite prominent to set financial incentives for conservation, but also not only governmental-led initiatives, but initiatives by the private sector, which is extremely important, as, for example, the resolution on zero net deforestation by consumer good firm, which was already adopted in 2010, to stop zero net deforestation by 2020. There's also these, for example, cross-company agreements like the Business Social Compliance Initiative, which tries to strengthen sustainability through a code of conduct, or several platforms and initiatives which developed, and last but not least, also sustainability standards, which are an important tool for strengthening the sustainability of companies. So coming from there, two key messages can be formulated. So although it is difficult to really clearly measure the causalities of these instruments, it can be said that the standards and labels, the commitments, the corporate social responsibility in general are a useful instrument. They lead the way in the right direction to combat deforestation. However, they need to be applied on a more global scale. For example, for now, there's this trend of sustainability standards being mainly applied in countries with good governance structure and with attractive supply chain characteristics, meaning low social and environmental risks. So there needs to be an increasement. Also in terms of initiatives within international reach and industry-wide initiatives to combat this, challenge in connection. So this also leads us to the second key message, which is the importance of holistic approaches, like, for example, landscape-based approaches, which can lay open goal conflicts, but they also can help to find solutions and should be built on multi-stakeholder coalitions in order to bring many different important actors together to harmonize public and private sector efforts through, at best, a cross-jurisdictional approach in order, for example, to harmonize differing definitions on forest and deforestation. So, but what has to be said is that although these policy responses and instruments, they set the scene in general to combat deforestation, but the goals have not been reached. So the tree cover loss in the tropics in 2021, which you can see on this slide, is still huge. There are 11.1 million hectares deforested and almost 4 million hectares of tropical primary forest loss, which is especially dangerous. So the commitments, as I said before, to halve or to end forest loss by 2020 could not even come close to being met. So there is this need for more instruments for making the existing ones stricter, and to not only, in a way, proceed with voluntary commitments and these political declarations of intent, but for companies to really bindingly record and minimize their impacts along the supply chain. And how to do this, my colleague will now take over and focuses more specifically on instruments and market mechanisms. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura, for this introduction and the background, and then also in particular highlighting where we are in state of research on the subject matter. And then Salwa now takes over and will present the second part of the study, where it's really more hands-on related to what kind of tools, approaches, mechanisms, incentives are available already for actors, for companies, and will enlighten us on that. Salwa, the floor is yours.
Is this on? I don't think it was on. Oh.
It's on.
Okay, it's on. Okay, great. So yes, I will start with giving you an overview of the different instrument that we have analyzed and assessed for the study. So starting with standard and labels. So basically, since we're looking at agricultural commodities, it made sense to look at standards for agro products, but also timber-based products. But I mean by this mainly packaging and storage for agricultural commodities, not timber, because it's under another EU legislation. And finally, we also looked at fish products, and I will tell you why later it made sense. So basically, for the existing standard and labels for agro products usually include sustainability standards that focus on social and biodiversity loss aspects and fair trade. And for some, deforestation is usually not really addressed. So we did an assessment of the different standard and labels and realized eventually that the best ones or the ones that did consider deforestation aspect to a certain extent were the Rainforest Alliance and UTZ certified. And following that, we also looked at, like I said, deforestation aspects for timber-based product, because they're really important when it comes to storage and packaging. And again, the most common labels and known ones are the FSC and PEFC and Rainforest Alliance. So these provide to a certain extent, let's say, they do consider deforestation aspects. So if you're a company who's looking into, I don't know, ordering like cardboards and paper for your packaging, then you should make sure that it's certified from these labels, because the wood there only comes from sustainably managed forests. Then after that, we also had a look at fish products. So at first, you don't really see the direct link with deforestation. But then looking at it, you can see that, for example, aquafeed, so the ingredients you give to fish in aquaculture, like soy, for example, they're also linked to deforestation. And then we also realized that shrimp farming in aquaculture ponds is responsible for mangroves deforestation. So it was also a very interesting aspect that it's not very clear at first when you think about fish products. And again, we have the storage packaging issue. So there are actually labels and standards that do take these aspects into consideration, for example, requiring that the products do not have any impacts on critical habitats like mangroves and wetlands. And some of them require that the aquafeed, like I said, the ingredients do not have or not linked to deforestation. And finally, again, the storage and packaging situation here. So these are the first set of tools we assessed, standard and labels. And then we also looked at tracking and transparency transparency tools, and Ghd Accounting Standards and sustainability reporting format. And these are actually quite interesting when it comes to deforestation-free or sustainable supply chains. So we looked at 3 different categories. So mainly greenhouse gas accounting standards, sustainability reporting, and tracking tools, including softwares. I'll tell you a bit more about this later. So basically, these are instruments that can help companies assess the impact, the environmental and social impact of their activities, and some of them have also deforestation components. So we can start with Ghd Accounting Standards. So like one of the famous one is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So basically, these standards can help companies assess their Ghd emissions. In this case, we're talking about Scope 3 emissions, so emissions from the supply chain. And an example here is that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol actually, it allows company to assess their emissions throughout the entire supply chain, and then you can actually see where the emissions come from and see if it's linked or not to deforestation. So it was also interesting to have a look at the advantages and drawbacks of each instrument when it comes from the company's perspective. And for example, for standards, they're actually quite useful because they give this set of rules and approaches that could also be adapted and simplified for SMEs. So this is also important because we also, the study is about companies in general, but we also try to consider small holders and small companies also. And they're also usually good because they cover different aspects throughout the supply chain. But then the drawbacks or disadvantages are the data that's required. So it has to be collected, and this can be challenging for some companies. And we also have the fact that usually greenhouse gas accounting standards mostly focus on emissions, and in other environmental impacts and social impacts are not really considered. And these are actually important impacts when it comes to the new EU legislation that Laura mentioned earlier. So following that, we have sustainability reporting. So it's basically a set of rules or guidelines that companies are going to use to self-assess and self-report on their environmental performance and sometimes also social performance. And following that, you can actually spot or identify the areas where improvement is needed and then take appropriate minimization or mitigation measures. And the most of the current reporting standards usually focus on social and environmental impact, but there are some who also that also directly focus on deforestation, like the Accountability Framework Initiative or CDP Forest. So there are actually different tools that companies can choose from. So, okay. Now again, thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of these of sustainability reporting. The advantages is that usually because you have a structured framework, this can be used to also develop bigger risk management strategies in order to know where deforestation is actually, so it can be used as reporting on impact and risk management minimization. And at this point, looking at the sustainability reporting that we have, it does not really, there is a framework that doesn't really address both social and deforestation, which is actually important in our case. And finally, I want to finish with tracking tools for supply chain transparency, and this is actually one of the most important ones based on the assessment that we've done. So these are basically tools and softwares that can help companies either identify areas where deforestation is happening, or basically also track the different stages of the supply chain and try to figure out where deforestation is actually happening. So we have three important software, and some of them, you have to pay for some of them actually, which is one of the drawbacks I will talk about later. So the first one is Global Forest Watch Pro. It helps you monitor deforestation hotspots. And and this way you can also have a deforestation free supply chain. Then we also have Trace, which basically gives you information on deforestation combined with the trade flow analysis. So it's really good to track deforestation that's coming from agricultural commodities, for example. And finally, Trace, which basically trace the product from the shop back to the place it was produced. So this does not actually include deforestation, but for example, Trace combined with another tool can give you an idea of whether the production place is a deforestation hotspot or not. So sometimes you also have to combine these different tools. So like I said, for the advantages, it's really good to know to locate, let's say, the deforestation risk areas and to monitor your activities and see if they have an impact there. But then one of the drawbacks, especially for Trace, is that sometimes it's not possible to single out specific supply chains and specific companies. I will show you an example to make it clear. So this is how Trace look like if you basically enter the platform, and in my case I entered Indonesia, palm oil, and this is what you get. And you can see, for example, you only have big exporter groups and importers, so for small companies it can be a bit difficult to use this tool. Okay, then following that, we also had a look at the different existing carbon pricing and trading mechanisms. We thought it would also be interesting. So I'll briefly talk about the four different ones that we've analyzed. So starting with the voluntary carbon market and trading mechanisms, it is actually suitable and directly applicable. It could be used to incentivize companies to transition into a deforestation-free supply chain. And it's the best applicable, escapable, and scalable mechanism compared to the 3 other ones I will talk about later, because it could also be used for smaller companies. It could be adjusted to the company's side. Like, to give you an example of how we could possibly work, let's say you're a German company who works with, I don't know, like a coffee supplier, and yeah, you want to help them, let's say, maybe start a project so they can, I don't know, like either maybe start to transition towards a deforestation-free production, or maybe adopt more sustainable agricultural practices. Then they can start the project, and then they can also sell the credits. So it could also be like a collaboration between both. And then we have Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So you have different articles, and in principle, it should be able to promote sustainable supply chains and contribute to avoiding deforestation. So you have different articles, 6.2, 4, and the mechanisms are going to be a bit different. But I thought, again, like giving you an example would help you have a better idea of how this could potentially work. So this is an example that doesn't really have something to do with supply chains, but I will show you how you can apply that. So basically we have the CLIC Foundation and Climate Sense, 2 foundations based in Switzerland, and they are doing this pilot project in Peru to try to meet the requirements of Article 6. So basically they've installed efficient cooking stoves, about 60,000 ones, and this is going to lead to reduced deforestation because of the cooking stove efficiency. And the credits that will be the utmost that will be generated are going to be transferred to Switzerland, so they can use them to meet their NDC targets. So you could easily imagine that a similar program could be done for sustainable supply chains instead. Now moving on to bilateral mechanisms. So the difference, something very important to keep in mind here is that these mechanisms here, they're mostly suitable for bigger programs and bigger projects. So this is not going to be possible for, let's say, small companies or 1 or 2 supply chains. So the idea here is to make sure that there is an umbrella organization that's going to, let's say, aggregate different or let's say trading associations or people who are organizations who are interested in one specific sector, or let's say one supply chain, and yeah, come up with like a big program. But it's not suitable for, unlike the voluntary market that I mentioned earlier, it's not suitable for small companies. So here we have an example of a bilateral mechanism, which is like a NAMA here. And it's actually an example of coffee production in Peru that's linked to deforestation. And we have a NAMA here to try to improve agricultural practices combined with innovative mechanisms to help reduce GHG emissions. So a similar situation, again, can be imagined for other agricultural commodities. Now, moving on to the last one, mandatory and national regional carbon markets, or CAPs. And this is quite interesting because you have to see it from 2 different perspectives. So either the trader or buyer EU side, or the supplier in the global south. So basically from the EU base, in Germany, let's take a Germany example, you will have legislation or that would put pressure on the companies to act and improve their environmental performance and make their supply chains more sustainable. But then on the global south, if you look at the global south, for most of the countries, there are till now no real legislation in place, so no pressure. So the idea is, and it's going to change eventually, and we also already see it with Indonesia. They're going to introduce a carbon tax in July, and it's also good now to keep in mind that Indonesia is one of the largest palm oil exporters. So this is probably going to have an impact on this sector, and it's also interesting to see or to imagine how this could work in the future. Now moving on to the last part, in practice, like what can companies do when looking at the different instrument, what can they do? And it's also very important to keep in mind that if you think at it at this thing from the company's perspective, you either have companies who only want to comply with, who will only want to comply with the legislation, and other companies who want to do more because they want to improve their CSR or because they really do believe in this. So this is how we decided to present things. So basically, if you look at companies who only want to fulfill the legal due diligence requirement, certification could be a really good option to start with. So only purchasing certified raw materials, and at the same time, the tracking and transparency tools that I mentioned, especially the softwares, they're actually quite good because they will help you, like I said, trace the deforestation hotspots. And yeah, but only it's good to keep in mind that these softwares can be a bit pricey. So again, it's based on the company's budget, and yeah. So the second situation would be a company who's actually proactive and wants to improve their CSR. So again, we have certification, but in this case, certification could be a bit different. They could actually work together with, let's say, suppliers who haven't been certified yet, and maybe I don't know, do a capacity building program to help them get certified. So it's just you're taking it a step further, and there are already companies who actually do this with a cocoa producer. So this would be from the supplier side, but then from the buyer side, so the German company, it could also look at getting certified, like I said, using the sustainability reporting tools, seeing where they stand, where do their emissions come from in the supply chain. And finally, they could also get involved in a carbon project. So either finance it partially and generate carbon credits. So this would be the next step. And finally, we have companies who would probably, let's say, commit to zero deforestation. So this is, again, another step further. And it's interesting to, again, looking at standards and labels, in this case, they should only use raw materials that are certified, but starting from the beginning of the supply chain. And this is an aspect that's actually important. I haven't mentioned it earlier, but even if when you look at standards, sometimes some standards are allowed to mix, let's say, certified and non-certified product, and they are sold as certified. It's like you have a different type of sourcing. So they could actually pay attention here and make sure that it's only deforestation-free raw material that is entering the supply chain. And again, from the company side, they could get a certification, like I mentioned earlier. They can also use the tracking and transparency softwares and tools. That's also a possibility. And usually these companies, if they commit to zero deforestation, they do have a bigger budget, so it's also possible for them to use these softwares. And finally, they can, in this case, have their own forest protection activities, so start an afforestation or reforestation project somewhere. Okay, so that was actually it. Thank you for your attention, and if you have questions, we're here.
Thank you, Salwa, for this second part and basically a very pragmatic company's point of view on all these tools, mechanisms, instruments are already available, and what it means, how you may use them, what are the issues related to that, what does it mean, company size, bundling, aggregating. So thanks for that. That was the second part of the study, which now we enter the second part of the session, where we have basically two organizations or people commenting or sharing views, and we'll start with Bernd Liss from GIZ, who will actually do two things. A, shares a bit the views of Germany, the German government, also because also BMZ has funding this study, and a bit how Germany, BMZ looks at this issue, sustainable supply chains. A bit the background also on the how we look at it, legal regulatory side, and of course, as GIZ, as an implementing organization, we are also interested in hearing what GIZ, from a practical point of view, on the ground already is doing or intends to do to support sustainable supply chain development implementation on the supply side, but maybe also bringing demand and supply together. Bernd, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Robert. Also, thanks to Laura and Salwa for setting the backdrop and also getting into practicalities. I'd like to first convey my warm regards from BMZ, Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. They also send their apologies that they cannot send somebody here directly. They are very busy with the negotiations, and you could imagine that a lot of things are at stake. So I'm glad to convey messages and also to give you an insight on what Germany and also the European Union is doing on the topic. As a forester, from my background and having been engaged in forest and climate policy, in RED projects, in the multilateral, up to the local level, the grassroots level projects, I'm of course very glad to represent GIZ here and to give maybe also some personal insights on the topic, because we all know that deforestation is still continuing. We have agriculture as a major driver, and we have to do something that we do not lose forests, but also biodiversity. A few words to GIZ. We are government-owned, and for those who do not know, German Development Corporation, GIZ is the government arm for technical cooperation internationally. We work in about 120 countries. We work with a variety of partners. Of course, we are government-to-government support, but we will also work with civil society. We work with actors. We work with networks. We work globally, and we also work at the local level towards sustainable development, supporting partners and actors to really walk the way towards sustainable development and climate resilient and low carbon futures. So why does the EU, why does BMZ and also GIZ, why do we engage in the topic of deforestation-free supply chains? First of all, after China, the EU is the second largest consumer of agricultural commodities driven by deforestation. So it's really something where we have a responsibility to engage. We import palm oil, soybean, beef, cocoa, natural rubber, all based on deforestation to a larger extent. Therefore, the EU has the responsibility to ensure that our consumption does not really lead to more deforestation. Preserving forests, I've said it, is essential to stop climate change, biodiversity loss, and to secure local livelihoods. But also the future of agriculture, the future of nutrition is depending on intact forest ecosystems and their ecosystem services. Think about water supply, think about soil fertility, soil conservation. And we all have learned agriculture causes at least 50%, if not up to 90%, depending on how you count, of global deforestation. And that's why we need to address agriculture and forest issues together in discussions in climate change. The agriculture sector, as being one cause for deforestation, is also part of the solution, so we have to address that. Through a legal framework for companies demanding that they address sustainability risks in their supply chains, we make an important contribution to the Paris Climate Agreement, the SDGs, and hopefully also to the upcoming biodiversity framework that is still to be concluded. We know that combining global frameworks has to be done with local action. And we also see that linking consumption and production is an imperative to drive things forward. So the interaction also of regulatory instruments and the voluntary instruments is very important, and the private sector plays an active role in that. We see even more and more companies coming forward. They are really engaging, but this is not enough because as we see, voluntary commitments are one side. This is good to have, but we need more. For a long time, governments and consumers have always relied on instruments like certification through recognized standards. But when we promote sustainability in supply chains, we have to address more. As I said, voluntary instruments are not enough. So for really addressing the transformation in sustainability standards, we need also to create legal frameworks. Germany has taken a first step in this direction with this Due Diligence Act that was mentioned. Companies are now legally obliged to respect human rights and certain aspects of environmental issues. But we also recognize that there is an importance to include more aspects with regard to the environment. And this is the reason that at the EU level we're going a step further. The European Commission has proposed 2 new laws: a directive on cross-sectoral due diligence on human rights and the environment, and a regulation on deforestation-free products. Discussions are currently ongoing. They are in full swing in the Council, in the Parliament, particularly on the regulation on deforestation-free products. The German government supports an ambitious regulation in this regard. As it was already stated also in our new government coalition agreement, we are really pressing for that. So BMZ welcomes very much the combination of the due diligence approaches and the obligations for companies, the principle that is underlying also the German Due Diligence Act, and also we support a country benchmarking. An important milestone in the Commission proposal are the traceability criteria. So in future, companies will have to know where is the plot of production. So to really make deforestation easy to detect and to monitor, in combination with data provision, we have plenty of opportunities now with satellite-based monitoring. So it becomes more and more traceable, and companies really have to prove that. It's important to BMZ and to the German government that companies on the ground not only audit and verify compliance, but also they actively engage in achieving standards. So they should engage with the suppliers, especially also with smallholders. They should really be part of a risk mitigation measure. So active support of producers by companies is essential to make a difference on the ground. We as GIZ, we are very much engaged also with the private sector. We try to link in public partnership, public-private partnership approaches, private sector with the technicalities, with capacity building, with policy frameworks, and then also in building up supply chains with consumers, with importers, with exporters. We are calling in certifiers like Rainforest Alliance, etc., to really beef that up and to complete the framework. The Commission and the European member states must also provide support to partner countries. I've mentioned that we get that through our bilateral cooperation. Therefore, BMZ calls for a more strategic framework to accompany a demand-side regulation in partner countries with production-side measures. This should primarily support vulnerable groups, such as smallholder farmers and indigenous groups, which are most prone to the impacts of deforestation, but also most vulnerable to climate change and all the impacts on livelihoods. With these legal provisions, with these instruments, with these legal instruments, we are establishing a level playing field in the EU. Sustainability thus becomes a competitive advantage, and the pioneering companies are rewarded for their commitment to a certain extent. The market also demands these products, and there's more and more awareness of consumers to really look into what companies provide, and companies, as I said, respond to that. So the regulation on deforestation-free products will not come into force before the end of 2024. So still companies have time to prepare for it, to set up their systems, and there's certainly always the discussion, how far can we go, how much time do we need. 2024 is at our doorstep, so they are quite advised to use this time to get prepared. What can we do from BMZ side? What also are we doing further from GIZ side? As I mentioned, BMZ supports this strategic framework on producing side measures under Article 28 of the EU Non-Deforestation Regulation. To this end, BMZ already supports multiple measures to minimize deforestation driven by agriculture that we as GIZ also implement. Some examples, maybe the NAMA facility was mentioned. We are engaged in the coffee sector there, in various other projects. We work with Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Indonesia, with the Côte d'Ivoire, with reducing deforestation driven by coffee, palm oil, rubber, cocoa, beef, soybeans, while, of course, looking into the local livelihoods and supporting people's rights. BMZ pursues this as a holistic approach and supports, for example, also living income strategies for small farmers to locally reduce the need to preserve forests and to make also a livelihood out of it. In addition, we have joined forces with the European Commission. We, from the BMZ side, but also from GIZ side, we are working in close contact with DG INPA, which are in charge for international cooperation from the side of Europe. We are looking in collaboration in a new program on minimizing deforestation driven by both domestic and international demand for agricultural commodities. This program will support 4 partner countries across the continents. Together with our key partner France, as another EU member state, BMZ is currently initiating a global Team Europe initiative on deforestation-free supply chains, and other member states are invited to join so that the force behind will be even bigger. We support companies in Europe, also small, medium-scale enterprises. BMZ and GIZ also support OECD and FAO with developing an OECD FAO handbook on deforestation, forest degradation and due diligence in agricultural supply chains. This shall guide companies, including small, medium-scale enterprises, to go from commitment to action. And it will also provide orientation on due diligence to minimize deforestation on regulated markets such as the EU, but also on other consumer markets, including China or India. The BMZ-GIZ Initiative for Sustainable Agriculture Supply Chains, in short INA, provides hands-on support for companies of all sizes in the food and agriculture sector. We hold monthly seminars, we inform, and we support practical tools and their implementation so that companies can really go forward fulfilling their due diligence obligations and minimize risks in their supply chains. Of course, the instruments that were proposed, Ghd accounting, data sets, monitoring, this is also something that we have plenty of experience, which we will involve as GIZ, including satellite-provided monitoring of forest areas. And this can be also another ingredient of the overall framework for implementing this very challenging topic. So with that, I'll give back to Robert for moderation.
Thank you very much, Bernd, for these insights into how the German government looks at the matter, as well as, again, very important, also when we designed this event, we clicked on implementation. So from what GIZ very practically is doing on the ground with the partners and sharing these insights. So now, then we another view and complementing basically here, let's say a bilateral a government and agency view. We would then like to ask Alejandro from the UNFCCC Secretariat, representing the international organization, who will share some insights into some outcomes of mapping surveys which the UNFCCC Secretariat with partners conducted, and that looks at some of the challenges, also the capacity building needs of, in particular, SMEs in the South, when they try to apply these such kind of tools, incentive mechanisms, protocol standards. And then also a bit, I hope to hear a bit about what multilateral, bilateral, and other actors can do to facilitate and support the development of sustainable supply chains. Alejandro, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's really a pleasure to be here with such distinguished colleagues with whom we worked in the past. Bernd, it's a pleasure to share the table with you also, and with colleagues from Climatekos. Yes, as mentioned before, I'm managing the capacity building subdivision at the Climate Change Secretariat, and basically our role is, of course, to support the intergovernmental process on all matters related to capacity building, and also support the work of the constituted body on capacity building, which is the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. And we also look at how to contribute to the implementation of the provisions of the Convention, the Paris Agreement, and the Kyoto Protocol on capacity building, particularly, for example, the Article 11 on capacity building in the Paris Agreement. So as mentioned, I would like to provide some insights from recent work we have been doing to try to map what are the capacity building needs and gaps of micro and small, medium-sized enterprises for them to engage better in climate action. We all know, and we heard from our discussions in the process, that the private sector, of course, is a very important stakeholder in supporting the implementation of the Paris Agreement. But as we all know, there are different types of private sector. There is a tendency to sometimes see the private sector as more from the perspective of the big transnationals, the big companies that have resources, that have skills, that are agile, and can act promptly if also the right regulations are put in place. But in reality, as we all know, a large portion of private sector activity is under small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly in the South. And in that premise, that's why we embarked on these mapping studies in several regions. We did one for Africa, Southern and Eastern Africa, for Southeast Asia, and one for the MENA region. We did them in collaboration with partners, for example, the MENA region study and the Asia study with the support of Climatekos, actually, and I'm happy to see Salwa, who is very much involved in these studies. And we also did the one in Africa and also in Asia in collaboration with the International Development Research Center. So the intention of these studies was to have an overview of what are these actual capacity building needs and gaps of SMEs and micro enterprises in those regions. But we also wanted to understand through these mapping studies, for example, what could be the role of academia and research organizations, local academia and research organizations as potential providers of capacity building to small and medium-sized enterprises. Because that's an issue that's been raised constantly in our process, the importance of engaging national, local institutions when providing capacity building to maybe reduce the reliance or over-reliance on external support, trying to build country ownership in this sense. So based on the outcomes of these studies, and I won't go into the details, we're about to publish these 3 studies and it will be on a web page, but just to some highlights that I think are relevant for the discussions here. One of them is that in all regions, it was refreshing to see that amongst medium-sized, small and medium-sized enterprises, there is a good level of awareness about the issue of climate change. It's not that like not aware, there is a good understanding that there is a problem, and also there is a strong recognition that is affecting the business models or operations of small and medium-sized enterprises. Particularly, and a large proportion of that, well, maybe just a bit backtrack. The methodology for these studies was a combination of desk research and surveys that were not done to individual companies. That would be maybe too overambitious, but using a lot of associations already in place in the regions. So from the outcomes of this research and the surveys, like I mentioned, there is a good general awareness of what are the climate change issues, and recognition of how of that climate change is affecting small and medium-sized enterprise, particularly in the agricultural sector, and that came out very clearly in all of the studies. In terms of extreme events, mostly droughts, floods, changing weather patterns, particularly for agricultural production, so those are recognized as some of the impacts facing a small and medium-sized enterprise. Another important element that came out of the study is that, and as Bernd mentioned, there is a strong and increasing need or requirements imposed on small and medium-sized enterprises to become more sustainable, or to be able to provide to larger companies along the supply chain, or be more compliant with, for example, climate change mitigation, etc. So, and that's from the study, the survey says that these companies are feeling the pressure because they're being requested to do that, which is a challenge, but also an opportunity. It's creating opportunities for new markets, for diversifying the intake of their products. But in that sense, and that is a major capacity gap, how can they become more competitive in these new markets? What are the capacities? How they can better integrate the climate aspects into their business models? We're talking here about very, very small enterprises, if you take into account micro enterprises. So that's one of the huge capacity building gaps and needs, how to better integrate climate dimensions into their business, and how to understand all these requirements. And I think it was mentioned in the presentation that some of these are maybe the standards are not suitable for small, medium-sized enterprises because of the complexity and maybe transaction costs that are involved in that. And also, I think Salwa and Laura, you mentioned capacity gaps and needs. So it's a recurring issue. Another important insight from these studies is access to finance, access to be able to transform a model, or to be able to transition to these more sustainable development practices. There is a need for access to finance, understanding the options and mechanisms that they could tap into for engaging more in climate action. Another important point that came through these studies is one has to mention that usually small and medium-sized enterprises have a basic understanding of regulations when it comes to the more technical regulations in terms of complying with emission protocols and this type of things, but there's a huge gap in understanding, for example, concepts like resilience, or how to even understand and assess climate risk in their operations. So that's one of the major findings also. And in terms of, but there is, and we saw examples because we've been engaging with other partners like the UN Global Compact and other UN agencies like UNIDO, that there are very already good examples of how small and medium-sized enterprises are supported. But there's still a need, and this is maybe going back to the question you asked, Robert, to maybe better enhance the support, scale up the support, and engage more the associations. It would be very difficult and maybe unrealistic to think of engaging single companies, but rather work through associations, existing associations at national level, but also going at the local level. So that's one of the findings, and I think here support would be useful. And like I mentioned before, engaging other local actors in trying to address these gaps and needs. And that's where, for example, universities, research organizations. But this would be, I think, important to mention that there are modalities out there like North-South type of triangular cooperation, and I think bilateral, multilateral donors. And I know GI said he's been doing this for years, can also come in and help support these efforts. And there maybe is something, and all these studies have a series of recommendations that we're putting forward to potential partners to continue exploring how to implement these recommendations. Like I said, and also particularly as related to articulated with different initiatives already out there. And also to tailor approaches to the national, but also basically local needs, because also it's, what we saw in the studies is that it's also very sector specific. Needs are very sector specific, and when it comes to the agriculture and land use sector, there are also subsectors in there, as we all know, that are very specific and might require particular gaps and needs. I mean, the examples of zero deforestation supply chains. So maybe it's also trying to translate, if I may use that word, all these standards and bring them down to a more local level to see what is in there for there and how can they apply them. Going back to language, language is a very practical issue, because when we did the survey, we didn't get that many responses at the beginning, because you're talking about small and medium-sized enterprises that work in their own language. So also need to try to customize support, take into account language issues. So those are some of the findings, and like I said, it's how to scale up this support, how to take into account the new elements. For example, in the Paris Agreement, Article 6 is something that it would be important how to start incorporating this into any support that we provided to particularly small and medium-sized enterprises in the context of them being able to contribute and benefit to this movement of sustainable or climate resilience value chains. Bernd, you mentioned that there is a strong demand from consumers, or growing demand. You see it very clearly in Europe. So how can ensure no one is left behind, and this becomes an opportunity and an additional challenge. So I'll stop here, but happy to continue the conversation. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thanks, Alejandro, for these insights from the mapping studies and surveys that the Secretariat, together with partners, did. Well, with that, we have come to the end of the presentations and the comments and views from GIZ and the Secretariat. So we have still some time left if there may be some questions. I see one here in front, another one. We were asked to, I mean, for us here in the room, probably don't need to, but if anybody is online, to use the mic. If I can ask them to hand it to the next one.
Thank you, Robert. And first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Nakul Sharma. I work for Climate Action Network South Asia. And, congratulations to both Salwa and Laura for the fantastic presentation and, making things crystal clear. I'll just follow back the conversation, which, just Alejandro had just, pinpointed us to the fact that there is a need to, work with small scale and enterprise capacity building, at the production side to make this this idea happen and for this regulation to work across. I would also like to underline what you had said, and by giving specific examples. I have a background in agriculture, and I've seen how value chain works across South Asia. And before saying that, I was astonished to see the map where I could, see very clearly. In Southeast Asia, there is a degradation of forest, but in South Asia, there's none, which is very, strange, because we supply a lot of basmati rice to Europe and US. We supply spices to the world. We supply, a lot of things. So probably the cause could be that we had already cut down all our forests because before satellites, started monitoring that. Keeping that aside, why Bernard also told that there is a, scope for capacity building for disaggregated or what you call aggregating the small scale farmers. I would like to underline that the way private sector works in my part of the world, it's the regard for environmental, water, and social causes is very less. So the more we can build the capacity of small-scale farmers, women self-help groups, because they are the farmers who care for agriculture, for soil, for water, because whatever they sow, they keep aside for their own consumption, and then rest of it, they sell it. So any idea how this initiative could trickle down the issue of capacity building at the lowest level, at the local level in South Asia or the global South? And second thing, maybe to Bernd, is that where do you see the scope of bilateral agreement or trade agreements? There is an agreement which is lurching between EU and India on trade, and food trade and all of these things is a priority for EU and India. Similarly, there is a trade agreement between UK and EU, which is landing. So how these trade agreements could play a very incremental and a decisive role in pushing carbon pricing and these things forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. If you can hand over the microphone to the colleague on the left, and as you already did, maybe if you can introduce yourself and your organization, and then your question and whom you wish to address it to.
Okay, thank you. I am Alex Prado from WWF Brazil. And well, different points are from him. So one is that about the standards that you are doing evaluation, CDP and so on, GG. One problem is that we've seen there in Brazil is that they don't evaluate the indirect land use change. When they go into the scope 3, that sometimes they go for the land use. For instance, the SBTI is flag, GGG is for forest. When they evaluate the scope 3, they don't go to the indirect, do you understanding? Indirect land use. As we say there in Brazil. And this is the hugest problem that we have there. So if we have the standards, we like them, because they're better than nothing, but still need to increase a lot to go really, if you want to stop the deforestation with these standards, they need to increase a lot their evaluation on scope 3 until the ILUC. If they don't go to the ILUC, the deforestation will still increase until the end of the forest. It's something that we are seeing that. So if we're looking for the market, that I like to, and how do you believe that we can do it together with them? This is one question. The second question is that when you see that German made an agreement with Peru I believe that maybe it's a readiness process to stop deforestation or try to stop, not sure. But until I don't know exactly Peru, but deforestation there is still rising as we are doing Brazil. So how can we, as a countries, using the market mechanism 6.2, 6.4, to really stop deforestation and make the evaluations every year, because we need to have that. Because despite that, if we don't do that, we will be a zero sum, so nothing, and we're going to happen. So thank you.
Maybe, okay, we take one more, and then we goes first, I think, here, somebody on the right. Or, yeah, if you can hand it over there, would be great. Or thank you.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm also from Brazil.
Okay.
I'm Tatiana. I'm from the Institute of Socioeconomic Studies, NGO, a Brazilian human rights NGO working with social environmental rights and climate justice. I'm also part of the Brazilian Front against the trade agreement between Mercosur and the European Union, and part of the global campaign Stop the European Union-Mercosur agreement. And I would like to make a comment. I listened with curiosity and attention to your presentation. And well, the comment is, you claim that there is no Global South legislation, regulation concerning trade issues, and I would like to ask if you have checked, for example, national laws on the environment, because it feels like trade regulations will not solve everything, and maybe it would be helpful just to enforce national laws on the environmental and social environmental agendas. And also it feels kind of inadequate to bring everything into trade regulations, from human rights to climate justice and social environmental issues. So that would be my question for you, if you've checked national laws concerning the social environmental issues, because it relates, right?
Okay, thank you. So we had, let's first take, there were a few questions, and then we see whether some time left. There was the comment here from India on SMEs and in the agriculture value chain, and then there was a question about the helping building capacities, small-scale farmers, SMEs, and how it can trickle down the capacity building initiatives. And I think it was addressed to Alejandro and Bernd. If there's something to say on that, who wants to go first? Alejandro, okay.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Bernd. Thank you very much for that question. I think that's an excellent question, and I think goes back to the point that you need to really look at the local context and understand what are the actual needs of skills, knowledge, understanding that farmers would need. And it goes back to the point that I was mentioning, based on the study, that for that you need to really engage the stakeholders that would be in the better position to provide that support. Could be local institutions, again, academia, but you also need to engage the other key stakeholders, the local governments, because you mentioned there is not an interest of the private sector really. But you need to work on that, because I mean these these farmers are selling their input to someone, and then I think you need to engage. And goes back, I think Bernd mentioned that point, that work with those companies that are at the end of the supply chain, so that could also support that. But I think that the most important aspect is to really work in the local context, and it's not. Because probably the small-scale farmers are the ones that are already facing the consequences of climate change in terms of droughts, precipitation patterns. So, and they know it. For them, it's obvious, and they've been working in that. So it's not. It's just to understand, to help them build the skills that would be necessary for them to. And that's not necessarily just agricultural practices. It's just understanding how to storage the products or these type of things. But I think it should be definitely a bottom-up approach with the key stakeholders at the local level, and connecting all the right stakeholders. So that's what I would say. But Bernd.
Yeah, thanks, Alejandro. Thanks to the colleague from India, also pointing out the importance of local livelihoods, the vulnerability, and especially the importance of women, the role of women in agriculture, in the local level economy cannot just be overestimated. Let me give you a practical example, because we're all talking about frameworks, legal provisions, etc. So how to really bring that to the ground? I've been working in the Philippines for 7 years, and part of our portfolio was REDD+, and of course, I took this on with my background really to lead a discussion on what are the supply chains, what is the impact on forest, and how can we involve all actors, especially the smallholders, on deforestation-free supply chains. The bottleneck is we did surveys with local farmers, and they said, we asked them the question, what is your most pressing need for addressing the issue of illegal cutting, of deforestation, and they said land use rights, access to resources. And the point is that resources all in the Philippines that is classified uplands, and this is practically 2/3 of the country, is under the Environment Ministry, DNR. And there are instruments, but there's quite a reluctance to really trust local communities to manage forest or even to use that in a multiple way. And the result is illegal logging, because the people, they are poor, they have to resort to the forest as a source of livelihood. So what we did was, with this analysis, we said, okay, first of all, we work on the land use rights at policy level, so driving this agenda. At the other hand, we support local farmers directly to increase their income, and we put them together with the market. And how does that work? We provided inputs. Of course, they also provided their own share in terms of labor. We provided the tools. We provided the funding for seedlings. And we did not plant. We planted also forest trees, but we did not plant forest trees in the first place. We planted cocoa, coffee, the fruit trees, what have you. And this was done around the homesteads of the farmers, so they could really easy access it, and it's also not under the DNR forest and land use rights access, because fruit trees are a personal property, whereas the forest is a common property. So we provided these inputs, and we also linked them to the market. We involved, for cocoa, for example, we involved Mars, we involved Philcocoa, which is a consumer, so it's a user of the product. And they, together with us, they provided the technical know-how, because cocoa needs a certain technical arrangement. We were in charge of how to grow. And the private sector, came in with trainings on how to dry, how to ferment, etc. So they could receive a high-quality product. At the same time, we cut off all the intermediaries that really made the lion's share of the funding, of the market value, and farmers. All of a sudden, first of all, they increased their capacities to produce a good quality product, and then they also had higher income. And we involved another actor, Rainforest Alliance, and they provided the certification for the product. And after a while, I've seen in Switzerland, Philippine cocoa products, chocolate, they won a prize. So they have access to the market now through these chains. The same we did with abaca. Abaca is a fiber, and usually it's like it's one of the Musa species, so it's like banana. It looks like banana, but it isn't. And this fiber is being used in a variety of products. And we were addressed by a German producer of tea bags, and they wanted to have their whole production organic, and also the tea bags you can provide from paper, etc. But abaca is a very, very good product for that. Fine fiber, and also there they needed high quality. So we linked them to the market, and they provided the training, we provided the ingredients. We helped the farmers not to deforest, but to plant abaca with shade trees there where there is already a deforested area. So we increased the carbon stocks in the spot, so did something for climate change at the same time for income of farmers. So it all boils down how to support. And when it comes to the position also of those who then would have to undergo certification or prove the access. Alejandro, you have named it. We have to work with associations. We have to agglomerate. And we build at the same time a kind of association, a community of farmers that marketed their products together. Better market price, better quality, in the end, better income. After 5 years, we did a resurvey. We had done a baseline survey, and we saw that the income of farmers has increased 17 to 28%, and this makes a difference. They could send children to school, so better education, etc. This has large-scale impacts. So this is also what we think, also from BMZ side. These are approaches where private companies, with their input, and it's in their own interest, good quality product, good market value. So, of course, they can, and also good PR. So the whole CSR policies are also included. So this is also where we would like to have the private sector involved with own input, but to the benefit of everybody.
We have a few minutes left before we have to close the session. There was something asked about also from colleagues from Brazil on the Scope 3 indirect land use and what is covered in the standards and how we can improve that. I don't know whether Salwa or Laura, you have something on what research science or from a practical point of view, what you think or something you found out in the studies you wish to share on that. And the last question we had also in this round, whether you have looked into the national legislation yet as part of the study. Maybe if you want to say something on that.
Yeah, I could start maybe with the last one, then go to your question. So we didn't have like a deeper look at each legislation. It's not possible within this study, but I don't know. I think from your question, I understood that you meant, why did I say that there were no legislations? This is what you meant, or maybe I understood it wrong in the back?
Yeah, of course, because national level legislation
Mm-hmm.
on social and environmental rights, for example, conservative rights, would help to deter deforestation nationally.
Yeah.
So in the national level, you can find some legislations to trying to force back deforestation on the national level, and then it would have an impact on trade. I can explain myself. So that was the question. If you could put together those two lines of investigation.
Yeah. No, I mean, we haven't looked at it, and it's something actually interesting, and yeah, we should do that, because it's also like, it's not, the study is not focusing on, let's say, mandatory the mandatory aspects. We tried to do like a little overview of pretty much all the existing instruments, but then you would need an extra study just for that part. Yeah.
May I just say something, because you also said there are national legislations, but they are not implemented. This is the major crux. We have in many countries very good environmental legislation, but it's not implemented. So we also have to do something on law enforcement. And this is one major aspect that we have to address in the governance sector.
And I think your question was related to Scope 3 indirect emissions and how we can include them in the... In the? Sorry? Indirect, okay. I mean, honestly, I haven't looked into, I'm not an expert in Scope 3 emissions, but what I can tell you is, like, one of the purpose of the study is also to see what is missing and what are the challenges when it comes to this, and it's something we should definitely include, and that should be also looked into. And the interesting thing is that when we do the research, we don't see this. Like, you're here and you're telling us, and this is good, but when you do the desk-based research, this is not the type of information you would find. And it's definitely something that we will mention in the challenges and the gaps that are here. Yeah.
It must be because agriculture, especially from this sector,
Yeah.
is dynamic.
Yeah.
So they can't walk.
It's
so
true.
if you only see the direct land use, you take one farm.
Yeah.
The cows comes from the other farms.
Yeah.
You know?
It's true.
So we make pressure on the forest from the other farms, not the only ones. So if you don't take the indirect land use,
Yeah.
you will not take the deforestation. It's a
Yeah, this is why the tracking tools I mentioned can also be important, because then you can source it back to where it actually came from. So, I mean, if you only look at certification, labels and standard, it might not be enough. That's why at some point you need to combine all of these tools to have a better overview of what's actually happening.
Now all of them, the biggest enterprise that we have in Brazil, all of them are labeled already. They have the standard, the UTZ, the UTZ, and GG, but in fact the deforestation is only
It's true. Yeah.
Something's wrong.
Okay, I think looking at the time, we have to come to an end. Unfortunately, well, there were many more questions, and we could have another lively discussion for another hour or so, never enough time. Just quickly wrapping up from the key messages, takeaways are basically from my point of view. So sustainable supply chains do support avoiding deforestation. There are many standards and labels already that take deforestation supply chain aspects into account. Also, carbon pricing, carbon trading mechanisms create an implementation framework and financial incentives for sustainable supply chains. And there is a toolbox for greenhouse gas accounting, sustainability reporting, tracking, and transparency of sustainable supply chains available. There are a lot of ifs and buts and open questions. Also, there was a question on which I expected, Article 6. And I would have a lot to say about that, but due to the of time, we can't do that. So with that, I would like to thank the panelists for the presentations, for the comments and views, the audience for listening and having interesting discussion contributions and questions. And wish you a nice day and see you next time. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. What are these questions?
Yeah, we need to catch up. We have some.
I was also thinking about it. It's quite
neglected.
It's fine.
It's setting up
for sure.
systems, etc.